I got a bad case of acne!
These gorillas won't be missed.
Was that Snarf?
Of course it was me!
Do you ever wonder what happened to those cartoon characters that mysteriously disappeared without saying goodbye? These cartoon characters filled our after-school hours, shaped our humor, and felt like friends we never expected to lose. But some of them vanished without a word, and no one ever told us why. Do you remember Fat Albert? Because one day he just stopped showing up, like a friend who never called again. He was once the warm, big-hearted center of one of the most community-focused cartoons in American television. Back in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids was more than a cartoon. It was a Saturday morning ritual. It was not flashy or loud, and it did not have superheroes in spandex or high-speed chases. It had kids, junkyards, and life lessons wrapped in funk music. That was more than enough for us. But by the time the series quietly ended in the mid-1980s, Fat Albert just disappeared. No finale, no goodbye, just gone. The strange part is how big of a presence he once had. Schools showed episodes in classrooms. Parents encouraged it. The show taught morals without feeling like a lecture. If your parents were working a second job or your older siblings had better things to do, Fat Albert filled in. He was calm, gentle, and always willing to listen. A kind of presence that made you feel safe, even through the screen. He taught you how to treat people with dignity when the world around you didn't always do the same. It was comfort food for the brain. Simple animation, grounded stories, and a group of kids who reminded you of the ones from your own block. That kind of honest television was rare, but it did not get a swan song. It just faded. The reruns dried up. The toys disappeared. The lunchboxes were swapped out for louder, shinier franchises. Maybe it was because trends were changing. Or maybe it was because the face behind the character, Bill Cosby, eventually became more controversial than comforting. But for those of us who watched, Fat Albert never got a real chance to say farewell. He just walked off into that junkyard, and we were left staring at the screen, wondering why no one told us it was the last episode. April O'Neil was never the one fighting off Shredder with nunchucks or bow staffs, but without her, there was no story. No sense of the real world reacting to 4 giant turtles living under a manhole. She was the anchor, a reporter with fire in her voice, rocking that yellow jumpsuit like it was made of armor. In the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles series from 1987, April was everywhere. On the front lines, inside the action, caught in kidnappings, rescues, and exposition dumps. She was in the thick of it all, until she wasn't. Later seasons of the show slowly shifted focus. There were new characters, new villains, and a lot more goofiness. April started appearing less and less, even though no one ever said why. One week she was in every episode, and the next she was barely on screen, replaced by filler arcs or one-off sidekicks. She had grit, smarts, and real-world perspective. Things the show desperately needed to stay grounded. When she vanished, so did the show's sense of reality. It was never addressed. No exit, no send-off, no "this is goodbye." Just a gradual phase-out, like the show itself forgot what she meant to the original fans. And that hit hard. For kids in the 1980s and early 1990s, April was one of the only women in a boys' world of cartoons who was not a damsel or a background extra. She stood up to danger, chased down leads, and held her own in a cast that was mostly mutant reptiles and masked ninjas. She was brave and smart, someone you remembered when the episode ended. So when she quietly vanished, it was more than just a programming change. It felt like part of the story had been erased. Even stranger, April showed up again in later reboots and spin-offs, but always changed. Different voices, looks, even backstories. The original April, the one that felt like a big sister or a neighborhood role model, never really came back. And the show never really acknowledged it. Just like that, one of the most recognizable faces in turtle history was gone. No goodbye, no closure, just a blank space where something important used to be. Jem was not just a cartoon character. She was a movement. Glitter, glam, rock and roll, all packed into a pink-haired powerhouse who lived a double life between corporate boardrooms and Battle of the Band stages. In the 1980s, Jem and the Holograms was what a lot of kids looked forward to right after school. It was color and drama and high-stakes emotion with a soundtrack. For many of us, Jem was the first time we saw a woman lead a cartoon with authority, style, and soul. She was not a sidekick. She was the story. And yet, just like that, she disappeared. The show ended abruptly in 1988. No series finale, no farewell concert, just canceled. One week, Jem was fighting for the spotlight, balancing the chaos of fame with her secret identity. And the next week, the screen went dark. You would check the TV guide hoping it was just a hiatus. But deep down, you knew. The show was gone. It did not help that reruns were rare and tapes were not easy to find. There was no real way to say goodbye. Jem showed young girls they could be leaders, creators, and icons, all while being unapologetically themselves. She was larger than life but still felt close, like someone you knew and wanted to be. That is the thing about shows like Jem. They are not just cartoons. They become part of your routine, part of your imagination. Jem taught us about ambition and friendship, about how to face rivals like the misfits without losing yourself. She made you believe that being bold and expressive was not something to hide. And then she vanished. No warning, no wrap-up. Just silence. You can feel the absence even now. The music still slaps, the style is still iconic, but the sudden stop left fans with this quiet ache, like being left backstage after a concert that never ended. We did not get to cheer one last time. We did not get one final encore. Jem deserved that, and so did we. Fenton Crackshell was the kind of character that made you do a double take. He was clumsy, frantic, insecure, and also a superhero. Not just any superhero, but Gizmo Duck, the cybernetic duck in armor who zipped through Duckburg at rocket speed while trying to remember his access code. He made his debut late in DuckTales, and for a while it felt like he was about to become the next big thing. He had his own arc, his own transformation, his own catchphrases. And then one day, he was just not there anymore. No farewell episode, no dramatic send-off, just silence. One week you were watching him juggle his double life as Fenton the accountant and Gizmo Duck the hero, and the next week he was replaced by something else, a different villain, a random treasure hunt, maybe an episode about Scrooge McDuck's socks. Anything but closure. That kind of disappearance hits hard, especially because Fenton stood for something different. He was not born brave. He was awkward. He messed up. He doubted himself. And that made him one of the most relatable characters on screen. He reminded kids that messing up does not mean giving up, that you could be flawed and still step up when it mattered. Gizmo Duck was not perfect, and that made him powerful in a totally different way. There is something especially sad about characters who grow, and then vanish before you see where that growth leads. Gizmo Duck had more heart than most other cartoon superheroes combined. He was learning how to be responsible, how to be a friend, how to be a son, and all that just ended in a blink. Not with a goodbye, not with a final mission, but with nothing. And for kids who saw themselves in Fenton, who were also figuring things out, also trying to be brave, that disappearance left a real gap. Sure, Gizmo Duck showed up again years later in rebooted shows, but that is not the same. The reboot changed his voice, his backstory, even his personality. It did not feel like picking up where we left off. It felt like starting over with someone new wearing his helmet. The Fenton we knew, the one who nervously blurted out, blathering blatherskite, and saved the day anyway. He never got his curtain call. He just logged out, quietly, while we were still watching. Uni was the heart of Dungeons & Dragons, the animated series. Not the strongest, not the smartest, not even the most talkative, but without her, the group never felt complete. She was the little unicorn companion who followed the kids into battle, into traps, into mysterious realms, and into moments that still hit surprisingly hard. Uni was innocence in a world full of monsters. Loyalty in a show that constantly reminded you that the heroes were stuck in a world that was not their own. Every time a plan fell apart or someone got scared, Uni was there, whinnying, nudging, galloping in circles. For a side character, she carried a lot of weight, not just as the token cute element, but as a symbol of hope, a reason to keep going. When you were a kid, you might not have realized how much emotion Uni carried without words. But looking back, her presence was powerful, which is why her sudden disappearance stung so much more. The show was canceled before it got to finish. The final episode was written, even partially recorded, but never animated, never aired. In that lost finale, we might have seen the kids return home. We might have seen Uni say goodbye, but we did not. That episode stayed buried for decades, a script collecting dust while fans were left wondering what happened. Uni was there one day, running beside the kids like always. Then the next, no ending, no closure, just silence. If you grew up with that show, you probably remember Uni's little cries during tense moments. You remember the way she reacted to danger, even when others were frozen with fear. She was not just a mascot, she was part of the team. But in the end, she vanished with the rest of the story, unfinished, unspoken. To this day, Dungeons & Dragons remains one of those rare shows that had real stakes, real emotional weight, and no goodbye. And Uni? She was at the center of it, right up until she was gone. Penny was the real hero of Inspector Gadget. Sure, her uncle had the gadgets and the trench coat, but let's be honest. He would not have lasted 5 minutes without her. Penny was the one solving the crimes, tracking the villains, hacking computers, and getting out of traps before Gadget even noticed there was trouble. If you grew up in the 1980s, you knew the truth. Penny ran the show, and she did it all with a talking dog and a computer book, until one day she just stopped showing up. There was no farewell, no big moment, no chance to acknowledge how much she had carried the show. Later versions of Inspector Gadget shifted the spotlight, sometimes reducing Penny to a side note, sometimes replacing her entirely. The rebooted versions made her older or reimagined her, but the version we knew, the one with the sharp brain and the quiet courage, faded out without a word. That hurts in a different kind of way, because Penny was one of the few girls on television back then who actually did things. She was not waiting to be rescued. She was the one doing the rescuing. She never needed permission to take charge. She just did what had to be done, episode after episode, without asking for credit. Kids picked up on that, especially kids who were used to being underestimated. So when she disappeared, it felt personal. You do not just forget a character like Penny. She was the reason Inspector Gadget did not walk off a cliff every episode. She was the reason the bad guys got caught. And when she was gone, the show lost more than a character. It lost its heart. Reboots tried to fill the space, but none of them captured what made Penny matter. The original never said goodbye to her. And that silence still echoes, long after the credits stopped rolling. Duke was the kind of leader who made you sit up straighter just by being in the room. In G.I. Joe, a real American hero, he was the moral center, the reliable voice, the one who always stepped forward when things went sideways. For a lot of us growing up in the 1980s, Duke was the face of the franchise. Not because he was flashy, but because he was solid, dependable, the guy you wanted on your side in any fight, which is why his vanishing act hit like a punch to the gut. In the original animated G.I. Joe movie from 1987, Duke is critically injured. We are talking about full dramatic tension, his brother sobbing over him, everyone reacting like he died. That was the plan. He was supposed to die. But after backlash from kids over Optimus Prime's death in Transformers, the movie, the studio panicked. They dubbed in a single line about Duke falling into a coma and recovering, right at the end. And that was it. Duke never really came back from that. He just faded. No grand return, no episode explaining what happened next. The series continued, new characters stepped up, and Duke became more of a background memory than an actual presence. It was like the writers were afraid to deal with the fallout, so they quietly swept him aside and hoped no one would ask too many questions. But we noticed, because Duke was more than a cartoon soldier, he was someone you trusted. He did not have laser eyes or a gimmicky backpack. He had calm, courage, and the respect of his team. Watching him vanish without closure made the show feel unbalanced, like something was missing and nobody wanted to say it out loud. He showed up again in later versions and toy lines, but never with the same weight. The damage had already been done. That original Duke, the one who led without fear and almost died doing the right thing, never got the farewell he earned. He just disappeared behind the noise of 100 other action figures, and we were left holding the flag, wondering where our leader went. Snarf was one of those cartoon characters you either loved instantly or took years to fully appreciate. In Thundercats, he was the comic relief, the nervous voice of reason, and the closest thing to a caretaker anyone had in that wild sci-fi fantasy world. He was not built for battle. He worried, he fussed, he panicked. But when you really think about it, Snarf was the only one trying to keep the team grounded. He raised Lion-O. He looked after the group when things got out of control. And underneath all the slapstick, there was heart, a lot of it. Snarf was the one who cared the most. That is why his slow fade out from the series hit harder than most people remember. One day, he was there in every episode. The next? Barely a mention. No dramatic exit. No heroic sacrifice. Just gone. It felt strange because for all his goofiness, Snarf was reliable. He was the kind of character who showed up for everyone else, even when no one showed up for him. In a world full of mutants, mystics, and magical swords, he was just trying to keep the fridge stocked and the kids safe. And that kind of effort deserves more than a quiet exit stage left. You can argue that the creators were trying to evolve the tone of the show, make it more serious, more action-packed. And maybe they thought Snarf did not fit in anymore. But when you remove the heart from a team, you feel it. Even if you don't realize it right away, things stop feeling as warm. The danger feels colder. The victories feel emptier. Snarf eventually showed up in a few reboots, sometimes as a pet, sometimes as comic filler. But he was never quite the same. The version that once sat you down and said, "Snarf, Snarf, be careful," while holding a bandage and a worried look, that version never really returned. He vanished without a proper goodbye. And like with any family member who fades from the picture without warning, you carry that absence with you longer than you expect. T-Bone was the muscle, the engine, the roar behind the jet. In SWAT Cats, the Radical Squadron, he was the pilot who made danger look easy, the guy who cracked a joke right before launching a missile. He was cool without trying. Alongside Razor, he flew the Turbocat like it was part of his soul. For kids who craved something faster, sharper, louder, T-Bone was it. The show itself was ahead of its time, darker, grittier, more high stakes than most of its Saturday morning neighbors. But SWAT Cats did not last long. 2 seasons, no ending, no wrap-up, no explanation. The series was canceled despite having strong ratings simply because the tone was too violent for its time. And just like that, T-Bone disappeared mid-flight. It is hard to explain how weird that felt back then. You had a show where the characters were finally acting like adults, where the risks felt real. T-Bone brought emotion to that. He was not just throwing punches or one-liners, he had loyalty, depth, and this quiet protectiveness toward Razor. And when the show ended without warning, he vanished with all of that. No last mission, no final showdown, just silence. The worst part? Fans never got to see where it was all headed. No backstory resolved, no future revealed. T-Bone had a past, a name, a story we were just starting to peel back, and then it was gone. All we had left were reruns and unfinished ideas. They talked about a reboot for years, even ran a Kickstarter. And while it sounded exciting, nothing quite replaced that original version, the one where T-Bone soared through the skyline like he owned it, cracking a grin before diving into chaos. He was the kind of hero who did not need a cape or a speech. He just needed a runway. And when they took that away, they never gave him a landing. Slimer was the wild card. the slime-dripping, hot-dog-gobbling ghost who somehow became the face of the real Ghostbusters. In the early seasons, he was everywhere. Comic relief, mascot, walking chaos. And somehow, even when he was just bouncing around, making noises and leaving green goo on everything, Slimer had charm. Kids loved him. He made the spooky stuff feel safe. You could have nightmares about the boogeyman, but then Slimer would zip in and accidentally save the day by knocking over a proton pack. At one point, he was so popular that the show even added him to the title Slimer and the Real Ghostbusters. That was not just branding. That was the studio saying, "This little green blob is our breakout star." And for a while, it worked. Slimer had solo segments. He had plush toys, Halloween costumes, lunchboxes. He was a sensation. But then things started to shift. As the show aged, it changed tone. It got a little darker, a little more serious. The original voice actors were swapped out. The writers changed. And little by little, Slimer stopped being a main character and started showing up only when it was convenient. No announcement. No moment where anyone said, "Slimer is leaving." He just quietly faded. That silence felt louder than any scream. Because Slimer was never about plot or power. He was about presence. When he was on screen, you felt like everything was going to be okay, even if Stay Puft showed up again. His disappearance was not dramatic, but it lingered. Like a light switch flipped off and nobody bothered to turn it back on. In later reboots and sequels, Slimer came back in different forms, sometimes fun, sometimes annoying, but never quite the same. The original Slimer, the one that made green slime feel like home, never got to wave goodbye. He just floated off screen, one episode at a time, until nobody noticed he was gone. Poochie was never supposed to last forever, but the way he disappeared still stings. In The Simpsons, he was introduced as a marketing ploy inside a cartoon that already knew how fake marketing ploys could be. Poochie was thrown into Itchy and Scratchy as a cool new character, complete with backwards hat, sunglasses, and try-hard energy. He was a parody, an obvious joke. But somehow, in the middle of that joke, we ended up feeling something real. He was annoying, yes, but he was also kind of sincere. Poochie wanted to be liked. He was trying so hard to fit into a show that never needed him. And just when you started to get used to his nonsense, even laugh at it, the studio yanked him out, literally. In one of the coldest edits in cartoon history, Poochie was erased mid-frame, and the voiceover just said he died on the way back to his home planet. That line became iconic. People quote it all the time, but look at it again, and there's something a little sad underneath the sarcasm. Poochie was kicked out of his own debut. Not written out with care, not given a send-off, just gone, mocked on the way out. A character so desperate to be loved, and the only response was a punchline. And yes, it was intentional. The Simpsons was pointing out how networks forced characters into shows just to sell merchandise. Poochie was supposed to be disposable. But that does not mean his vanishing did not land with a weird kind of emotional weight. Because maybe you have felt like that too. Trying too hard in a room that does not want you. Being edited out before you get to finish your line. Poochie became more than a gag. He became a reminder of how fast the spotlight can turn off, and how sometimes, even in satire, you feel the sting of a goodbye that never really happened. Elmyra Duff was chaos in a bow. She was that kid who meant well but caused absolute destruction everywhere she went, all in the name of loving animals just a little too hard. In Tiny Toon Adventures, Elmyra was unforgettable. She was loud, unpredictable, and somehow both terrifying and hilarious at the same time. She was not just a one-joke character. She was a presence. And for a while, you saw her everywhere. She chased cats, hugged bunnies until they popped out of their fur, and smothered everything in sight with affection. You could argue she was one of the most quotable characters in the whole series. But then, she was gone. No explanation, no final gag, just less and less screen time until she disappeared completely. And it felt strange, because Elmyra had so much energy. You expected a big exit, a final scene, a huge cartoonish blowout. But instead, she was slowly erased like she had been too much for the writers, or the audience, or the tone they were shifting into. One season, she was front and center. The next, she was gone. Even her attempted comeback with Pinky, Elmyra, and the Brain could not hold on. The show barely lasted. And instead of a real return, it became more like an echo. Not the Elmyra we remembered, but a version trying to fit into something that did not want her either. That short-lived spin-off might have been the last time we saw her try to stay in the spotlight. She never got her big beau. Her last hug, her last, "I will love him and squeeze him and name him George." Elmyra faded without a trace, and for someone who was all about grabbing attention, that kind of quiet exit feels even louder. Montana. Max was loud, obnoxious, and rich, and that was the point. In Tiny Toon Adventures, he was the spoiled brat antagonist, throwing tantrums in mansions and firing people with a snap. He was the miniaturized version of every cartoon villain in a suit, only funnier. Even when you hated him, you kind of loved having him around. He was the kid who could buy the moon if it meant winning an argument. He made greed ridiculous. And in a cast full of adorable animals and wacky dreamers, Max was the one who reminded you that some kids just had too much power. He had a signature scream, that wild temper, his weird friendship with Elmyra. And still, somewhere in the chaos, you sensed there was more to him. There were glimpses, quick moments, where he seemed lonely, not just loud. You wondered if the money and meltdowns were just how he covered up not knowing how to connect. That underneath the yelling and money throwing, he was still just a kid, one who did not really know how to make friends. He was the kind of character built to grow over time, but he never got that chance. Montana Max started showing up less as Tiny Toon Adventures went on. New characters were introduced, the tone shifted, and Max, who had once been one of the core figures in the cast, was quietly benched. One episode, he was running the school with money and menace. The next, he was barely there. No exit scene, no downfall, not even a final gag. He just vanished behind the velvet curtains of Acme Acres. You would think a character with that much energy would get some kind of send-off, a last failed scheme, or a meltdown too big to ignore. But instead, he faded without noise. It is strange to say that about someone who used to yell every line. But that is what happened. Montana Max, the character who made being a villain look like a full-time job, just stopped showing up to work. And you feel it more than you expect. Because Max was not just a villain. He was a mirror. He reflected all the things kids knew about unfairness, about money, about bullies, about the kids who got everything and still wanted more. He was ridiculous, but he was real. And when he disappeared, that little bit of bite went with him. No tantrum, no farewell. Just one more forgotten rich kid who bought his way out of the story and never came back. Randy was not the hero. He was not the villain. He was just a kid, a regular human who happened to discover something magical and decided not to run away. In The Littles, Randy was the connection between our world and theirs. He found this secret society of tiny people living in the walls, and instead of panicking, he helped them, protected them, kept their secret. And for a while, he was a big part of their world, and ours. You could relate to Randy because he was not special in the superhero way. He could not shrink. He did not have gadgets or powers, but he had empathy. And in a cartoon filled with wild adventures and shrinking furniture, that meant something. He reminded you that kindness was its own kind of superpower. In a show about impossibly small people, he was the one who made the world feel bigger. He represented the best kind of ally. Someone who was not the center of the story, but who still mattered deeply to it. Until one day, he just stopped being there. There was no moment where Randy left. No scene where the Littles said goodbye or thanked him. He just started appearing less and less. One episode, he would be helping them build something, or keeping adults away. The next, he was missing completely. No mention, no explanation. And if you blinked, you would miss the fact that he was even gone. That kind of disappearance hits differently. Because Randy was never loud. He was never the star. He was the friend who showed up when needed, then quietly stepped aside. So when he disappeared, it felt too real. Like a kid who moved away and never got the chance to tell you, you just came home one day and they were not on the porch anymore. And what made it harder was that the littles kept going. The show still had adventures, still had its cast. But something changed. Without Randy, the connection to the outside world felt thinner. The stakes felt smaller. The bridge between us and them had disappeared. And the show never really built a new one. Randy never came back in reboots, never popped up in later adaptations. His absence was permanent, and nobody on screen seemed to notice. But we did. Because sometimes, the quiet characters leave the loudest silence behind. IQ was never the flashiest Planeteer. He did not wield fire or wind or call down storms. He did not have the most screen time. But when you needed someone who actually understood the problem, IQ was already working on the answer. On Captain Planet and the Planeteers, he was the technical brain of the group. Quiet, calm, and often in the background, but always there. That is why his slow disappearance from the show felt like losing the compass without realizing it. IQ was the Planeteer who made science feel like a superpower. He used his brain instead of his fists. While other characters shouted or rushed in, IQ was the one working out the solution in his notebook. He represented logic, patience, thoughtfulness. And when the villains were dumping oil or burning forests, he showed you how knowledge could fight back just as strongly as any magic ring. He gave quieter kids someone to look up to. Someone who did not have to yell to be heard. You do not forget a character who showed that thinking before acting was heroic. But as the seasons went on, IQ started to vanish. Not all at once. Slowly, bit by bit. Fewer lines, less screen time, whole episodes where he would be technically present but barely say a word. And then, eventually, he was just not there. No goodbye. No story arc. No moment that acknowledged his role. The show kept going. The Planeteers kept saving the world. But one of their own had faded out and nobody seemed to notice. And that is what makes it so strange. Because for kids who looked up to him, the quiet thinkers, the ones who solved problems instead of shouting, IQ was everything. He proved that you did not have to be the loudest to make a difference, that you could be soft-spoken and still matter. His disappearance left a specific kind of emptiness. You did not always notice it during the explosions and speeches, but when the episode ended, you felt it. Like something was missing from the group photo. Like someone left the lab door open and no one came back to close it. IQ was never flashy, but he deserved a better ending than being overwritten by louder voices. He helped save the planet and then quietly disappeared from it. John Candy was one of the most beloved comedians of the 1980s. So when Camp Candy debuted in 1989, featuring a cartoon version of Candy running a summer camp full of misfit kids, it seemed like a sure hit. He voiced himself, and his larger-than-life warmth translated beautifully to animation. But even with his star power, Camp Candy could not find its place in the crowded world of Saturday morning cartoons. The idea was simple. John Candy was a goofy but lovable camp counselor guiding kids through the chaos of camp life. Hikes gone wrong, pranks gone wild, and the occasional heartwarming lesson. But the show leaned too hard on its simplicity. The humor was soft, the stakes were low, and the animation was just passable. It lacked the energy and punch needed to grab kids who were used to watching monsters, heroes, and space battles on other channels. To make matters worse, the show arrived during a shifting moment in children's entertainment. The early 1990s were right around the corner, and shows like Animaniacs, Batman, the animated series, and Rugrats were about to change the game. Camp Candy felt like it belonged to an earlier era. It was sweet but slow, funny but forgettable. The show ran for 3 seasons but never gained a strong following. Today, it lives in the background of nostalgia, more of a fond memory of John Candy than of the cartoon itself. Sometimes even the warmest hearts cannot keep a show from cooling off. Kissyfur sounds like a joke. It sounds like the name someone makes up when trying to parody a children's show. But in 1986, it was real. And not only that, it aired on a major network. This was the story of a young bear cub named Kissyfur and his father Gus, who moved to the swamp to start a new life after escaping the circus. That premise alone should tell you how weirdly specific this show was trying to be. Kissyfur himself was just okay. He was a typical good kid protagonist, kind, helpful, and a little too perfect. There were no real stakes. The villains were two bumbling alligators who failed at everything, and the adventures were usually about community problems, like fixing a dam or helping a friend build a house. Sweet? Maybe. Memorable? Not in the slightest. Kissyfur ran for 2 seasons but was quickly forgotten in reruns. It had none of the punch that made other 1980s cartoons so rewatchable. Today, it exists mostly as a footnote, a relic of the brief moment when networks thought kids wanted tender swamp dramas instead of high-octane toy tie-ins. Sometimes a cartoon's heart is in the right place, but its paws are stuck in the mud. Michael Oliver was the kind of kid who could turn chaos into comedy. As Junior in Problem Child, he was everything the title promised. Wild, loud, hilarious, and just a little dangerous. He was not your typical sweet-faced Hollywood kid. He was a troublemaker you could not help but love. And then, like the perfect punchline to a joke we did not see coming, he was gone. His exit was sudden, but the signs were always there. The Problem Child films made money, but they also made problems. Legal disputes, managerial chaos, allegations of financial exploitation. Behind the scenes, Michael's world was unraveling before it even had a chance to begin. By the time he was a teenager, the industry had already burned him out. He did not just step away, he stepped back into anonymity. And he has rarely looked back. Today, Michael lives far from Hollywood's orbit. He is not trying to reclaim fame. He is not on reality shows or writing tell-all books. He is just living, quietly, on his terms. And that silence says more than any interview could. It says he chose peace over applause, privacy over profit. That, maybe the only happy ending left for a child actor, is to become someone the world forgets. It is easy to think of these stars as lost, but maybe they are not lost at all. Maybe they just escaped. And in Michael's case, maybe disappearing was the bravest thing he ever did. Celia Hodes from Weeds was not just a villain. She was the venom that gave the show its bite. Narcissistic, manipulative, delusional, but also oddly magnetic. She began as the annoying suburban neighbor, but evolved into a full-blown antagonist, injecting chaos into every scene she touched. And yet, in the end, she simply disappeared. No fiery ending, no justice served, just gone. Her last appearance was quiet, out of step with the rest of her character's dramatic flair. And after that, nothing. The show moved on, almost pretending she never existed. That absence spoke louder than anything she ever screamed on screen. Celia had been a linchpin of the early seasons, a foil to Nancy, a danger to herself and others. She spiraled, she burned bridges, and she always clawed her way back into the spotlight. Until one day, the spotlight cut off. Fans were left stunned, not because she was missed, though some did, but because a character so bold was denied a bold ending, a villain without a finale, a chaos engine without a crash. Some say her character arc had run its course. Others believe behind-the-scenes decisions played a role. But nothing excuses the lack of resolution. She was not a background player. She was front and center. And when a show lets someone like that vanish without a reckoning, it leaves a gaping hole where drama and accountability used to be. It is not that Celia deserved redemption. She deserved consequences. And instead, she got a ghost exit. If there was ever a cartoon that perfectly captured how clueless the rich looked to regular kids, it was Beverly Hills Teens. Airing in 1987, This show thought it was being glamorous and fun. But to the kids watching at home with broken remote controls and boxed macaroni dinners, it felt more like a taunt. The series followed a group of high society teenagers living in ridiculous luxury, complete with private limousines, mansion estates, yacht parties, and closets full of designer outfits. It was supposed to be aspirational. Instead, it felt tone-deaf. Each character was a walking stereotype. There was the spoiled princess, the handsome jock, the nerdy outcast, and of course, the evil rich girl. But unlike the charm of something like Gem and the Holograms or The Heart of Saved by the Bell, this show never gave its characters any depth. The drama felt fake, the dialogue was unbearable, and every single episode was dripping with privilege that made no sense to the average viewer. It was like watching a teen soap opera written by someone who had never met a teenager or a human being. And it flopped. Hard. Kids could not relate to it. Parents found it obnoxious, and critics panned it as out of touch with its own audience. The show barely lasted a season, and even nostalgia cannot polish this one. It is not remembered because it was good. It is remembered because it felt like a parody of itself, even when it was trying to be sincere. For a show about the rich and fabulous, Beverly Hills Teens had absolutely no staying power. If there was ever a cartoon that perfectly captured how clueless the rich looked to regular kids, it was Beverly Hills Teens. Airing in 1987, this show thought it was being glamorous and fun. But to the kids watching at home with broken remote controls and boxed macaroni dinners, it felt more like a taunt. The series followed a group of high society teenagers living in ridiculous luxury, complete with private limousines, mansion estates, yacht parties, and closets full of designer outfits. It was supposed to be aspirational. Instead, it felt tone-deaf. Each character was a walking stereotype. There was the spoiled princess, the handsome jock, the nerdy outcast, and of course, the evil rich girl. But unlike the charm of something like Gem and the Holograms or The Heart of Saved by the Bell, this show never gave its characters any depth. The drama felt fake, the dialogue was unbearable, and every single episode was dripping with privilege that made no sense to the average viewer. It was like watching a teen soap opera written by someone who had never met a teenager or a human being. And it flopped. Hard. Kids could not relate to it. Parents found it obnoxious, and critics panned it as out of touch with its own audience. The show barely lasted a season, and even nostalgia cannot polish this one. It is not remembered because it was good. It is remembered because it felt like a parody of itself, even when it was trying to be sincere. For a show about the rich and fabulous, Beverly Hills Teens had absolutely no staying power. Tasha Yar was bold, strong, unapologetically fierce. As chief of security on Star Trek: The Next Generation, she brought grit and grounding to the bridge of the Enterprise. Then, in Season 1, she was killed by an alien force with barely any ceremony. Her death felt abrupt, underwhelming, even random. But that was not the end of her story. Yar kept coming back in strange forms, alternate realities, time loops, and even as a cloned villain. Each version chipped away at her legacy until it became unclear which Yar fans were supposed to remember. She became more concept than character, a symbol of creative guilt playing out through convoluted canon. What began as an impactful loss was slowly diluted by repeated reimaginings. Instead of giving her the honor of a full goodbye, the show kept rewriting her shadow. And in doing so, it left her fans unsure if she was remembered out of respect or out of regret. Was she the tough security chief who stood her ground, or a recurring phantom kept alive by narrative guilt? Behind the scenes, actress Denise Crosby left due to frustration with how little her character was being developed. The writers tried to make up for it, but in trying to keep Yar alive, they muddled what made her matter in the first place. What happens when a character dies too early and then lives too long in the wrong ways? Joel Osmond saw dead people, and then he saw no one. As the wide-eyed child in The Sixth Sense, he stunned the world. Critics, audiences, directors, Everyone called him a prodigy. And for a while, he lived up to every inch of it, role after role, award after award. But then, the industry did what it always does. It moved on. Or maybe Haley did first. He made the boldest move a child star can make. He disappeared by choice, not by scandal. In doing so, he proved that fame did not own him, even when the world tried to claim him. Instead of chasing fame into his teenage years, Haley made a decision most child stars never even consider. He stepped away, went to college, lived among classmates who barely knew he had once terrified Bruce Willis on screen. He studied acting not to keep the fame alive, but to understand it better, to rebuild it on his own terms. And when he did return, it was not as the fresh-faced boy we remembered. It was as a character actor, bearded, funny, strange. He leaned into roles that were bizarre, offbeat, sometimes unrecognizable. And maybe that was the point. He had no interest in being who we remembered. He wanted to be someone new. Haley never really disappeared. He transformed, quietly, with grace. He avoided the crash, the scandal, the tragedy. And somehow, that made him stand out even more. In a world of child stars who vanish under the weight of what they were, Haley Joel Osmond simply chose to become something else. Monica Dawson from Heroes should have been a game changer. She had one of the coolest powers introduced in the entire series, the ability to mimic any action she saw perfectly, instantly. She was young, smart, determined, and she had a real connection to the larger story. But in a series that promised to celebrate unique gifts, Monica's gift was quietly buried. She was introduced in Season 2, given a small arc of personal growth, and then nothing. No death, no abduction, no heroic sacrifice. She was never seen or mentioned again, like she had never existed. It was a silence so sharp it felt deliberate. The kind that makes you wonder if something was taken from us, if the show got scared of its own potential. Monica was more than her power. She represented possibility, representation, legacy. She was a black heroine in a world that sorely lacked them. But she was dropped without explanation, as if her story was just a side note in someone else's saga. Fans kept asking, what happened to Monica? Where did she go? But the show never answered. Not in later episodes, not in comics, not in any spin-off. Her narrative thread was cut, clean, and cruel. And with it, something powerful was lost. In a series that kept bringing back characters from the dead, Monica's absence felt intentional, which made it hurt even more. Heroes promised to be about people discovering greatness inside themselves. But when it came to Monica, they blinked and let her fade away. In the shadow of Thundercats and Silverhawks came Tiger Sharks, a cartoon that tried to dive deep but barely made a splash. Created by Rankin Bass, the same minds behind some of the most iconic 1980s action cartoons, Tiger Sharks was supposed to be their next big franchise. But unlike its feline and metallic siblings, this aquatic spin-off never found the current it needed to survive. It sank fast, and today, most people do not even know it existed. The setup was familiar. A group of heroes, half human, half sea creature, defended the underwater world of Water-O from evil alien pirates. They had a base, a mission, transformation sequences, and of course, a whole arsenal of water-themed powers and gadgets. But something about it just never came together. The characters were flat, their personalities barely distinguishable. You had Mako the leader, Dolph the dolphin guy, Octavia with her 8 arms, names that sound cooler than the characters ever were in action. The biggest problem, though, was timing. By 1987, kids had already chosen their champions. Thundercats roared, He-Man ruled, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were just around the corner. Tiger Sharks was too little, too late. It did not help that it was buried inside the comic strip, a syndicated package show that split attention between multiple series, making it harder to follow or care about any of them. It never got a toy line, never got reruns, and was never given a proper home video release. Tiger Sharks is the definition of forgotten. an ambitious but ultimately aimless swim through shallow waters. Dewey from Malcolm in the Middle was the quietest chaos in the house, and maybe the best part of the entire show. Eric Sullivan played him with a kind of genius that people often overlook in child actors. He was unpredictable, offbeat, somehow both the weirdest and the most lovable member of the family. But once the show ended, something odd happened. Eric did not just take a break, he disappeared entirely. No tabloid drama, no failed comebacks, no wild interviews, just silence. After one final voice role and a small indie film, he dropped out of Hollywood and never looked back. For years, fans searched. There were fake accounts, Reddit threads, even hoaxes. People genuinely wanted to know, where did Dewey go? Unlike other former child actors, Eric did not feed the nostalgia machine. He did not show up at reunions, did not post throwbacks. He just walked away from everything, which made it all the more mysterious. People speculated that maybe he wanted a normal life. Maybe he had just outgrown the spotlight. He had always been more reserved in interviews, more thoughtful. Maybe it all just became too much. What we do know is that he enrolled in college. He stayed close to his hometown. And he left the fame behind like it was never something he needed in the first place. Still, the absence feels loud. Malcolm in the Middle is one of those shows people return to again and again, and Dewey's disappearance is the one thing no one can quite wrap their heads around. When you watch it now, you find yourself focusing on his lines more closely. You look for signs, for clues. But maybe the answer is simple. Maybe Eric Sullivan just wanted to live his life without the noise. Even so, it is hard not to feel a little sad about it. Not because he owes anyone anything, but because we never got to say thank you or goodbye. 7 from Married with Children was the kid who was never supposed to stay, but no one expected him to be deleted like a glitch. When he first showed up, he was introduced as a long-lost cousin dumped on the Bundys by even more dysfunctional relatives. He was weird, he was needy, and he stood out like a sore thumb. But that was the point, right? To add chaos to a show already built on it? Yet, instead of embracing his awkwardness, the show seemed to regret him. As fast as he arrived, he vanished. No goodbye, no foster care plot, no update from the family who had to raise him. Just gone. And somehow, the show never looked back. The strangest part? 7 was in the opening credits for a while, even after he stopped appearing, like a ghost haunting the couch. Rumors swirled for years. Some blamed negative fan reaction. Others whispered about behind-the-scenes drama. But no official explanation ever came. It was as if the show wanted to pretend the experiment never happened, even though everyone remembered it. That kind of disappearance does not just rewrite a character. It rewrites reality. And that silence? That was louder than anything the show could have said. 7 was not just a forgotten side character. He was a child, a member of the household. And yet he was discarded like a failed experiment. It turned a comedy into something darker. Because when you erase a child without explanation, it stops being funny. It becomes tragic. Even in a show built on dysfunction, there should be some line. But 7's disappearance reminded us that in television as in life, some people are just left behind, and we never get to ask why. Gary Coleman was one of the biggest stars on television in the early 1980s. He was charming, funny, and instantly recognizable thanks to his role on Different Strokes. So it made perfect sense that someone would try to bottle that magic in cartoon form. But what came out of that idea was the Gary Coleman Show, and it is one of the strangest attempts at animated stardom ever made. In this show, Gary plays a character named Andy LeBeau, a kid who dies and becomes an apprentice angel sent back to Earth to earn his wings by helping other children. Yes, that is the plot. A cartoon about a dead child helping the living. Somehow, this was meant to be heartwarming and funny. Instead, it was jarring and deeply confusing. The show tried to be moralistic in tone, but it never quite figured out what age group it was speaking to. The animation was stiff, the dialogue was clunky, and the moral lessons felt forced, like after-school specials squeezed into a format that could not support their weight. Each episode would end with Gary's character learning a lesson, usually in the most obvious and uninteresting way possible. And unlike his live-action counterpart, animated Gary lacked any of the comedic timing or charisma that made the real Gary Coleman a household name. Even more unsettling was how the show tried to balance comedy with this overarching concept of death and redemption. Kids watching cartoons on Saturday mornings were not prepared to wrestle with angel bureaucracy or celestial missions. They wanted slapstick, action, and talking animals, not metaphysical career development in the afterlife. The Gary Coleman Show ran for just one season in 1982. It quietly disappeared from the airwaves, never making it into the ranks of reruns or nostalgic retrospectives. It remains one of the most bizarre footnotes in cartoon history, proof that star power alone cannot save a show that never should have existed in the first place. Misha Barton's face was once impossible to miss. The OC turned her into a household name almost overnight. As Marissa Cooper, she was the show's emotional core, a mess of contradictions, heartache, beauty, and self-destruction. And that role made her famous. Overnight, she was everywhere: magazine covers, paparazzi shots, red carpets. But when her character was killed off in season 3, something shifted, and fast. Her departure from the show was dramatic, both on-screen and behind the scenes. Marissa's death was shocking, but what followed was even more so. Misha did not pivot to blockbuster films or major TV dramas. Instead, she kind of just disappeared from A-list attention. There were rumors, creative differences, burnout, even whispers of behind-the-scenes drama. Whatever the reason, she vanished from the kind of spotlight she once owned, and in its place, a lot of tabloid noise. Misha became more known for what happened after fame than during it. She was photographed more for what she wore at gas stations than any new role. She tried a few comebacks, reality TV, indie films, smaller parts, but nothing ever stuck the way the OC had. It is easy to forget just how young she was when everything hit. Misha was barely out of her teens, and she was dealing with fame levels that would have broken anyone. Now, when people look back on the OC, her absence is what stands out most. Everyone else got some version of a second act. But Misha? She left the main stage and never really came back. There is something especially haunting about that, because for so many fans, she was the show. And when she vanished, it felt like the whole world of the OC cracked. Sometimes disappearing is not about failure, it is about escape. And maybe Misha Barton knew she had to step away before the industry consumed her entirely. Mara Wilson did not just play magical girls, she was one. To anyone growing up in the 90s, she was the bright-eyed child who brought life to characters we adored. Whether she was teaching a cruel headmistress a lesson in Matilda or navigating grief in Mrs. Doubtfire, Mara had a presence that was impossible to ignore. She had a warmth that could cut through any screen and land softly in your heart. And then, almost overnight, she was gone. Not fallen, not broken, just elsewhere. As it turns out, Hollywood was not the sanctuary it pretended to be. Mara's decision to leave was not sudden, but it was necessary. The industry that once celebrated her began to suffocate her. By the time she was a teenager, acting felt more like a performance off-screen than on. She was growing up in a space that did not allow her to grow. So she walked away. From the lights, the scripts, the expectations, and towards something truer. Mara became a writer, an advocate, a voice for children who never had one. She opened up about mental health, grief, and what it meant to be a child star when the cameras stopped rolling. And while we lost her as an actress, we gained her as a witness to a world most of us never see. The one behind the curtain, the one without the glitter. Her words became a new kind of performance, honest, brave, and often heartbreaking. Some child stars fade because the world forgets them. Mara chose to disappear because she remembered herself, and in doing so, she showed us that there is life after the applause ends, a life of purpose, of survival, of healing. That might be the greatest role she has ever played. Seven was the Bundys' unexpected adopted son in season 7 of Married with Children. He came out of nowhere, literally dropped off by relatives, and was folded into the family like a sitcom experiment. Blonde, wide-eyed, and a little clueless, Seven was supposed to be a fresh spark, but audiences never warmed up to him. And just as suddenly as he arrived, he disappeared. Poof, no goodbye, no send-off, no teary farewell. It became a running joke on the show. His face even showed up on a milk carton in one episode, mocking his own exit. But the humor could not hide the awkward truth. Seven was a mistake. A character added under pressure, then deleted under silence. There was no emotional arc, no integration, no real effort to make him fit. His character floated like a ghost over every episode he was in. And when he vanished, it was like the show was trying to laugh off a panic attack. Behind the laughter was a silent admission. Some experiments are too awkward to own. Still, he represented something bigger. He showed us how even chaotic shows like Married with Children were not immune to executive meddling and mid-season desperation. And his vanishing reminds us that sometimes even fictional families reject what they are told to embrace. What does it say when a kid is dropped off, forgotten, and barely even missed? Miss one of these characters? Tell us who. Hit like if it brought back a memory and subscribe for more stories that never got their goodbye.